The key to controlling the scope of tag helpers is the add tag helper directive. In order to use tag helpers on a page, you need to include this add tag helper, and that makes them available to that particular view. Now, it would get a little bit tedious to add multiple tag helpers to every view in your application. So commonly what you do is you put this directive in the _view imports.cshtml. That's a shared view within an ASP.NET Core application. And by including them in that particular file, they're available to all Razor pages. And by default, that's all view files in the views folder and subfolders that inherits that file. Okay, so that's commonly how you do it. The standard project template does exactly that and includes all of the built-in tag helpers. Just keep in mind that you need to include this add tag helper directive for all assemblies that contain tag helper definitions that you want to use in a particular view. Okay, and then here's the syntax, the typical syntax for doing this, and this includes all of the built-in tag helpers. And in this case, the syntax uses the wildcard in order to make available all of the tag helpers in the specified assembly. So the first parameter is which tag helpers you want to include, in this case all of them, and the second parameter is the assembly where the tag helpers are defined. And again, because this is in the view imports file, this is going to make that set of tag helpers available to every view file in the views directory or the subdirectory. And if you create your own custom tag helpers, you'd need to add a directive like this and specify the assembly that contains the helpers. And the nice thing here is that if you include this statement and other assemblies that define tag helpers that you want to use throughout the application, if you then have a separate assembly that has tag helpers that you want to use with just one controller or one view within a particular controller, you can use the add tag helper to add the assembly just to that particular view. But then there are lots of options to control which tag helpers are available. So one option is to then use the remove tag helper to remove any tag helper that you previously added, such as for a specific view. So if you use the remove tag helper within the view imports file, it's going to remove the tag helper from all views. But if you use add tag helper within the view imports, but then remove tag helper within a specific view, it's going to remove that tag helper or that collection of tag helpers from all the ones in an assembly from that specific view. And just like add tag helper, you can use the wildcard to remove all tag helpers in the assembly that you specify in the second parameter. Okay, so now you can start to see that it really lets you get very granular. But even more so, you can use the bang operator to opt out of using a tag helper, using a specific element within a view as a tag helper. Okay, so the way you do this is you prepend the element name with the bang or the exclamation mark to preclude the use of a tag helper on a specific element in a view. And now you're really getting granular. Okay, and here's the syntax for that. So if I want to have a span here that might otherwise be treated as a tag helper, I just include the bang before the element name in both the opening and the closing tag. And the nice thing here is that if you're using Visual Studio and you create a span tag with that bang character, then Visual Studio will automatically add the closing element with that same bang element or bang character. And then there's another option with the tag helper prefix. One of the possibly problematic things about tag helpers, the way they're implemented, is that they're used implicitly. That is, just looking at a view, absent the syntax coloring that you get in Visual Studio, there's no way to know for sure that a particular element is a regular HTML element or a tag helper. And this, in fact, was a point of concern in the early days of the development of ASP.NET Core. So what you can optionally do is you can use tag helpers explicitly And the way you do that is you define a prefix to use on tag helper elements. And you do that with the tag helper prefix directive. And so here's the syntax of how you would do that. And th is a common convention for tag helper, but you can use any prefix you want. And then you have pretty much the same scoping rules as for add tag helper. So you can include the directive in view imports or in individual views. And there's an example of using it. So if I include the tag helper prefix and define the prefix as th:, then I would need to use th: on every element within that view or collection of views, depending on where you define the tag helper prefix. You'd have to use th: on every element that you want to use as a tag helper. Anywhere you don't use it, it will be treated as a regular HTML element. Okay, here I am back in Visual Studio 2017, the release candidate, and I have open the web application, the generic application that I created from the project template that has the authentication features added to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here into Views and go into the Account Controller and open up register.cshtml. Now I really like this view for showing off tag helpers because the view itself isn't all that complicated, it doesn't go on all that long, just has a few elements. This is the view that's used to gather the information to allow a user to register as a new user on the site. So it's gathering email address, name, a couple things like that. Nothing really all that intense. So here we have several HTML elements as well as tag helpers. Unfortunately, what's kind of interesting here is that there isn't the syntax highlighting for tag helpers. So this is a regular HTML element, but this is a tag helper. In this particular case, you're just going to have to trust me that's a tag helper, but there's no difference in the highlighting. So it appears that just didn't make it into the release candidate of Visual Studio 2017 yet. So I'm going to fall back on 2015, same kind of project, here in the Account Controller and open up Register, and you can see the highlighting because of the different colors. Well, no you can't, but wait for it. There that goes. Takes a second for IntelliSense to figure it all out and parse the page and apply the different highlighting. Because it did have to go in and see which tag helpers were available, and then it was finally able to display all of the syntax highlighting. So now you can clearly see, at least I hope you can on the video, that the div is kind of a blue color, and there's another one there, and so forth. But then the tag helpers are this kind of green or teal, whatever color that is. So it's a distinctly different color. I happen to be using the standard dark theme within Visual Studio, but you can go in and change all the colors to your heart's content, even within whatever theme that you have selected. Here within Tools, Options, Fonts and Colors, and then come down here to HTML, Razor, Tag Helper Attribute, and Tag Helper Element. And as you can see, they're both that, I guess it's teal officially, that color there. But you can set it to any color that you want, so if this just isn't enough of a contrast between HTML elements and tag helpers, you can make that much more distinct. Okay, so let's talk more about the tag helpers. And just to first make sure, yeah, see, the problem in 2017 isn't that it just wasn't a bit of a delay. It's actually not, the syntax highlighting isn't working. So I'm sure by release that's gonna be in effect, and it'll be like this. Tag helper attributes like ASP4 and ASP validation 4, those attributes are processed on the server. So keep in mind that tag helpers, all of the processing happens on the server, which then generates HTML as part of the HTML output that is sent to the client browser. Okay, so attributes like ASP4 are called bound attributes and aren't rendered in the final output to the browser. But then unbound attributes like class there, notice that it's in a regular a regular attribute color under the syntax highlighting, so this isn't a tag helper attribute. This is called an unbound attribute. And that's going to flow through to the rendered HTML that's sent to the browser. Okay, and just keep in mind that you can control these colors through tools, options, fonts, and colors. Okay, now let's look at the view imports. So here's where that add tag helper statement is. And notice my highlighting. The dark theme has a couple little issues. So I actually have tag helper highlighted there, but it's the same color more or less as the just what it is when it's not selected. Can't even see any difference there. Okay, but there's the entire statement. So I have the tag helper. I want to include all of the tag helpers that are defined within the Microsoft.asp.NET Core.mvc.tag helpers namespace. Okay? Okay, so that's where that's going to pull in all of the tag helpers, and because it's in view imports, it's going to be included in every view within the application. Okay, now I'll come up here, back over to register, and I'm just going to come down here and add a span class. And if I explicitly want it any tag helpers that would apply to this, well, in fact, let me do this. I'll do an ASP-4 equals, let's go with validation, sure. Email is one of the elements. Okay, notice the IntelliSense. I went by that kind of quickly. So notice that even though this looks like a string, I start typing email, it's looking at the model that is bound to this and knows that this needs to be a property on the model, along with a couple other things. And so it's going to bind to email. And I'll close that tag. And notice that because I used a tag helper attribute, the ASP validation 4, then it recognizes this as a tag helper because there's also a tag helper within that file of standard ASP.NET Core tag helpers that targets span elements. So this is now identified as a tag helper, and you can see that because it's the kind of teal color. But if I wanted to explicitly exclude this, I could just add the bang there, and notice Visual Studio helpfully adds it to both the open and closing elements. And if I remove the highlighting, notice that it's now reverted to the blue because this is no longer a tag helper. So that's how Visual Studio has this nice help for visually seeing what's a tag helper and what's not. Because you kind of need to know what's a tag helper because those elements are going to be modified in some way when the page is rendered and sent to the browser. Okay, there's other IntelliSense. If I come down here, go to a place where it makes sense to include a label, and my tabs are a little bit off, so I'm going to do Control-KD. Kind of reformats the page so that everything's in line with my tabs. And I'm going to start typing an open angle bracket L. Now what's nice here is that notice that it identifies the label element there, but it has this @ symbol above the open and closing brackets. So that identifies this as an element that is targeted by a tag helper. I still need to include a tag helper attribute to make this a full-fledged tag helper. But you do get this IntelliSense. And really nice thing in Visual Studios, you get this description of the element and so forth, and it tells you that there's a tag helper that targets that label element. Okay, if I backspace here and type in an H because I want to insert a header, notice that there's no @ because in the tag helpers that I have attached to this view at the moment, which are the standard built-in ASP.NET Core tag helpers, there's no tag helper that targets the header element. And so you don't have that @. And so IntelliSense is telling you which are tag helpers. Okay? So it's really pretty nice. It makes it really easy to develop these applications and know exactly what every kind of element is. Okay, I'll backspace again, and I'll actually put in a label and space. And this gives me a list of the possible attributes that are available for the label element. And of course, it's HTML. You can include custom attributes if you want. But notice that we get the same kind of IntelliSense. So I have the ASP4 that has the @ sign. So that indicates that that's an attribute for a tag helper. And in fact, all I need to do is add one of those. And the list is going to vary by different kinds of elements. That's going to, by including one of those, it's going to turn that into a tag helper. So if we scroll down here, we see the ASP4. I don't remember if that's the only one. It may be. Yeah, okay. So ASP4 is the only attribute, only tag helper attribute that applies to the label tag. And again, different elements will have different attributes that identify this as a tag helper. Okay, so as soon as I select that and hit the tab key, the color changes and this becomes a tag helper. And I know that even though I haven't finished defining this element yet. So I'll hit enter. And then notice IntelliSense doesn't pop up immediately, but what I can do is hit Control Spacebar to pop up that, and I can see which values are available. And again, it's using the model expression class in order to use the complete word feature of IntelliSense to give me all of the possible values that I can set for this attribute. Again, this is not just a random string. This needs to be bound to that model. Okay, and so strictly speaking, I'm now in C# because I'm looking at the properties and various other features of the model expression class that are available in this context. So we've made a context switch here, but even though it looks like I'm just writing HTML. So it's really pretty cool. It's a very seamless experience. I think Microsoft did a really good job on all this. Okay, so these are all the methods and properties on the page model. And those are available again because the property type here is model expression. Okay, so I'll select email from the list again, and it pops it in. And then I'll start adding the class attribute. So notice that that's not highlighted as a tag helper. I automatically get this pop-up, and you can see that I get the IntelliSense for standard HTML attributes as well. Okay, so I can come down here and select that and finish out the element there. Okay, so the help or the support in Visual Studio is pretty sweet. Unfortunately, this hasn't made it into Visual Studio Code yet. So if you're using Visual Studio Code on another platform or on Windows, it's not built in. But apparently Microsoft is planning on adding it. I wasn't even able to find a reasonable third-party add-in to code to provide that functionality. So hopefully that'll come soon. But it is part of Visual Studio, and I'm pretty confident it'll be in Visual Studio 2017 whenever that ends up getting released. Okay, so now I'm going to come over here to the shared folder. So this is within the Views section. So I'm going to look at Layout, because I want to point out a little bit different kind of a tag helper. Notice that for a moment I didn't get the syntax coloring, but now I do. And the one I want to talk about is this environment tag helper. This is an interesting example of a tag helper that contains child content. Its reason for being here is to let you render different chunks of HTML depending upon something about the environment in which the code is running, such as whether or not you're in development, staging, or production. Okay, so as you can see, there's two here, one for development and another for both staging and production. You can include comma delimited lists for multiple environments. So the idea here is that in development, you may want to include the full unminified versions of JavaScript and CSS files, while in production, you may want to use the minified and bundled forms of the code. So you can see that I'm including the Bootstrap CSS and the custom site CSS for the development environment. But here in the staging and production environments, I'm going to include the minified version of Bootstrap. And then if it's not available at that CDN, I have a couple of fallback locations as well. And then similarly, I'm going to use the minified version of the site CSS. Now, keep in mind that the bundling that goes on here, by default still, as HTTP2 becomes more prevalent, bundling is going to become less of an issue because with HTTP2, you don't have nearly the performance hit of requesting a number of different files. It's really pretty cool, and it's a nice thing that Microsoft is building in support for HTTP2 within its server software and development tools as well. So we're not fully there yet, but we're getting there, and browsers need to support it as well. Okay, so how does the tag helper know which environment this is running in? Well, nothing magic going on. It uses the ASP.NET Core environmental variable, which, if it's not set, is assumed to be production. So if I go back up here, right-click on the project, and go into the project properties, I can go to the debug tab and see that by default in a new application, that ASP.NET Core environment variable is set to development. So in production, I would need to remove that, and there's some automated tools that let you do that, or explicitly come in here and remove this. And I can either remove it because the default is production, or I can explicitly change the value to production, whatever works for you. Okay, and then there's also the environment tag helper down below here to include script files on every page or every view within this application. Keep in mind that the layout file is by default part of every view within the application. You can remove that and change it and have control. That's nothing new in ASP.NET Core. But here it's including the development forms of the files, and these are the unminified, uncompressed, unbundled versions of them. And then for staging and production, same sort of thing. I have the minified and bundled, and doing bundling and all that, and using a CDN and so forth. Okay, so pretty slick. So if I go ahead and run the application, take a few moments to whir and click and clank and load up the page. I could have started without debugging to start up a little bit quicker, but oh well. All right, and there we have the opening page of the standard application. If I right-click on this and view page source, you can come up here and see that because I'm running in the development environment, I have the unminified forms of those files, unbundled and everything. And same thing, if I come to the bottom of the page, you can see that I have the unminified versions of the script files as well. But if I were to change the environmental variable, I would get the different versions of those, including to use by default the CDN versions of the files. All right, and the other thing that's interesting about this is that the environment element itself didn't get output to the page, either at the top or the bottom. So this is a case where the element that I use in the view doesn't get output to the output HTML that's rendered in the browser. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you define tag helpers if you're going to build your own custom tag helpers. Okay, one more thing I want to do here. Yeah, let's close the tabs. Let's explicitly shut that down. And I'm going to close this project. And real quickly create another. But this time I'm going to create a classic ASP.NET web application. And I have that weirdness over there. See if it affects things. Okay, so I'm going to create an MVC application. MVC is selected by default. Keep in mind this is a classic ASP application. By default, it includes the individual user accounts. I'm not going to host it in the cloud. All right, we have the new project, and I'm going to go into that same view under Account, the Register, and just wanted to point out how differently this code works, which uses HTML helpers. And it looks like IntelliSense is getting caught up with what's valid here and so forth. Doesn't matter to us now. But notice all this little islands of C# code that we have in here with different highlighting, because technically this is entirely C# code right there. And so you have that kind of distracting highlighting. But here really shows up the problems. One of the problems that tag helpers is designed to solve is that it was very difficult for web designers, before they handed off the project to developers, to be able to write this kind of code in order to link all this stuff up and identify it. So if we come back over to the 2017 version of the project, this code is much easier for designers to write, even if developers have to come in and put in the tag helper attributes. So overall, it makes for a much better collaborative kind of development work using tag helpers. Okay, so there's some explicit differences between HTML helpers and tag helpers. The first is that tag helpers are attached to HTML elements in Razor views. And that's what gives us this relatively clean HTML view as compared to this, which has code and HTML intermixed. So HTML helpers are invoked as methods, and they're interspersed with HTML within Razor views. And you generally need to use an @ sign here to indicate that there's a context switch to C# code. So it tells Razor that this is the start of code. And then fortunately it's smart enough to know when it gets to the end of code. But even if it isn't, there are delimiting features that you can use, such as this right here. Okay, then another issue is this begin form method. The last argument here is an anonymous object that's used to represent attributes. Because the class is a reserved keyword in C#, you have to prepend it with that @ sign in order to force C# to interpret @class_equals as a symbol or a property name. To a front-end designer, someone who's familiar with HTML and CSS and JavaScript and various other web technologies, but not C# and Razor, most of this line of code right here is foreign. And so they would have to put in a regular opening form tag, and then the developer would have to completely rewrite it as a tag, as a HTML helper. But that becomes much more sane within tag helpers because you're working with a form element there. Still need to add some additional stuff, but you can put in the method, the post, and the class, and so forth. And the nice thing here is that you get IntelliSense help, as I showed you earlier, with pretty much every part of creating this line. Okay, I kind of pointed this out, but by default, the Visual Studio Editor displays C# code with a gray background, highlighted like this. And to my eye, it's just, I know I can change that in the fonts and settings, but I would have to figure out something else that would work. So it'd probably take a lot of experimenting. As opposed to tag helpers, it's a lot more attractive. At least here, again, I'm in 2017, and so it doesn't have the highlighting enabled. But with the syntax highlighting, the color coding, it's much easier to identify this, and just much easier for me to scan through this and understand what's going on. So I think you'll agree with me that the development experience of tag helpers is far better than HTML helpers.